And we are back. Guys, please excuse the long delay in production. The show format has switched to a live stream that's available on LinkedIn. We go live every Tuesday at noon Eastern with a few surprise episodes in between here and there. So please make sure you head over and check that out. Those are very engaging conversations, and you can contribute in real time. Now, we will be releasing all those episodes here on audio format as well, so stay tuned for that. I just wanted to address the sort of long production delays that we've had. And either way, I appreciate you guys listening. Thanks so much. This episode is brought to you in part by Veeva. Veeva connects patients, sites, and sponsors on a single technology ecosystem to make clinical trials easier and faster. Look, you guys know by now, I'm a huge fan of SiteVault. SiteVault gives research sites one place to work with their sponsors, so we're not having to use all kinds of different systems and logins. We're able to get rid of all of the ridiculous binders that I hate so much and turn our regulatory fully electronic. It's been a huge savings for us. We love using it. Our regulatory team loves using it. Sponsors love using it. Basically, all those documents are available at all times. It's really changed the way that we do business. There are already more than 4,500 sites using SiteVault. There's more than 400 industry sponsors that also use Veeva clinical applications. About 65% of all global clinical trials run on Veeva. Now, that is an insane amount of sites, sponsors, and trials. The best part, SiteVault is free for sites. So if you want to learn more, please go check out Veeva SiteVault. It is at sites.veeva.com. Again, I really can't recommend it enough. There's also some really cool other features once you dive in. Once again, that is sites.veeva.com. All right, guys, hello and welcome to another Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Our guest this week is Kerri Weingard. Kerri is a founding partner and global chief operating officer at Verified Clinical Trials. VCT is the largest global research subject database to reduce dual enrollment and help prevent protocol violations. Ms. Weingard is also the CEO and founder of Study Scavenger and Clinical Hero. Both companies are dedicated to clinical trial recruitment and education, respectively. Kerri, who is a nurse practitioner, also holds a master's degree in science from Stony Brook University. Before creating VCT and Study Scavenger, she's conducted over 500 clinical trials as a research administrator and sub-investigator. She's got more than 2 decades of experience in the field and is a member of a number of different professional organizations, including the American Society for Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, the Drug Information Association, and the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, or ACRP. Guys, a really cool conversation. Something that I don't think gets quite enough attention. We talk about dual enrollment and the messes that can cause when it comes to clinical trials. So without further ado, Kerri Weingard. All right, our guest today is Kerri Weingard. Kerri, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you, Brad?
Oh, not too shabby. You know, life at the site is always exciting. If there's anything you can say about it, it's definitely that. And it's extremely hot in Oklahoma City. Where are you at?
I'm based half the year in New York. That's actually where our headquarters are on Long Island. But then half the year I get to be in Florida. So I have a pretty good mix of weather.
Nice. Yeah, I guess you can hit the timing right. Always be in a fairly nice place. Yeah, we're hitting like 110 this week, so it's not comfortable. We're not used to that here, so.
I'm sure you're sending that our way, so I'll thank you in advance for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I like to open the show like I do, all the others. It's always really interesting to hear people's backgrounds, kind of what brought them into the clinical trial space. I've stopped being surprised by how it's oftentimes sort of a random occurrence, but nonetheless, it's still interesting to me. But if you would, just kind of tell us your, clinical trial backstory. What are your origins, if you will?
Sure. So I'm a nurse practitioner by trade, and I started my research experience at Sloan Kettering in New York City, working in prostate cancer. Then had children, moved out to Long Island, and then started a business of starting research companies. I was hired as consultant by physicians to start their research practice. And then I did another one, worked a little bit for Novartis as a scientific liaison, and then was hired by a Dr. Mitchell Ephros to start his research practice. And this was probably about 2001 or so. And over that first, 8 years of working in clinical research, I was really frustrated. I was pissed off, to be honest, with the lack of our ability to detect professional research subjects or to protect somebody who was lying coming into a clinical trial and was actually already in another clinical trial. And we only found out because they messed up. Like if the subjects came back, they would come back with the different bottle of medication, sometimes a completely different study and a different subject number. And I didn't even know anything about that study. And sometimes it was the same study and just a different site number and a different subject number. And we knew they were enrolled in the same trial twice.
Sure.
I also was getting really frustrated. I always say I was a bitter coordinator because I think so much work falls on the coordinators. But I was also really amazed as I saw research advance from 1990 to 2000. The protocols were getting more and more difficult, and there was more and more criteria that they were asking the research site staff to confirm. So in that inclusion and exclusion criteria, there's a million questions, yes or no. But many of them relied on the subject being a dictionary or being an encyclopedia of everything they'd ever done in the past, or expecting them to only have done research at your site, or expecting that they would be fully forthcoming with all of their research experience, which was just not the case. So, many times I would run down the hallway to the PI at the time, Mitchell Ephros, and I would start yelling at him. And he's like, "Why are you yelling at me?" I'm like, "Because we have another duplicate subject, or we have another professional subject, or we have another subject who didn't know the rules of our industry." And after years of, I think, him hearing me bitch at him all the time, we literally were out with our whole staff one night and he said, "Why don't we do something about this?" He's like, you're catching these people and we're one little site. We were phase 1 through phase 3 clinical research site in New York. So not so little,
Sure.
But we were in our little world. And so we started to reach out to other research centers. We started to speak to a lot of our colleagues, and anyone on the front lines knew this happened. They have their own stories. So we were like, okay, let's go to the FDA and let's get a system created. And we met with a wonderful woman from the FDA, and she was like, "We hear you, but this is not even on our radar screen. This is not where we're going this year, next year, 10 years. We're not doing this yet. This is not on our agenda."
Sure.
And so we then decided to create a research subject database, a tool that the research site staff can use to look back in the research subject's current and past research experience. As a research coordinator or past administrator, we don't have a crystal ball. And yet, the inclusion and exclusion criteria almost expect the PI and the coordinator to have that crystal ball. When you ask in the inclusion and exclusion criteria for a QTC interval to be less than 450 milliseconds, you give an EKG machine. When you ask for blood pressure to be less than 140/90, you have a sphygmometer. So why, when you're looking at the half-life of a past drug, or whether or not the subject's currently in another clinical trial or has been in the last 30 days, why is it not mandatory to use a tool, to use technology? So I get really frustrated when sponsors don't feel like it's their responsibility to incorporate this technology or this step into research. The research sites, it's not their data. It's not the PI's data. It's not the coordinator's data. They are gathering the data for the sponsor to be given to the FDA. So in my mind, the sponsors have to require this. They have to do good clinical practice. They have to step up and say, we can do a better job helping the sites truly assess the subject's eligibility. We have to give them a tool to help them. There's no crystal ball. The subjects are either deceptive, they're lying to come into the program because they want to go into phase 1 and earn thousands of dollars. And then they're doing their CNS trial. They do have depression or they do have schizophrenia, but they're lying to one site. So if you're lying to come into a trial, why wouldn't the sponsor or the PI if they knew, or the CRC if they knew, why wouldn't you think they're going to lie to continue throughout the program? Are they lying about adverse events? Are they lying and raising placebo rates? There's so many issues with that deceptive population. But now, and since COVID, we also have like the desperate population. And those are people that maybe have multiple comorbidities and don't have the financial means to pay for the doctor copays and to pay for their medications. So they're using research as standard of care therapy. So in that situation, they're getting their diabetes medication at one site, and they're getting their hypertension medication at another research site, and they're getting their insomnia medication at another research site. And that's a perfect storm for AEs, SAEs, and data failure. But we also have the desperate situation in debilitating diseases. We see it in Parkinson's, MS. More treatment will be better. It'll cure me. In oncology, we're seeing this. So that's not the deceptive, fraudulent patient. That is the, oh my gosh, I don't have the money, or I don't have the means, or I'm scared population. But let's make it even more complicated. Let's add to that digital advertising. We need patients. Recruitment companies are all over the place, and they're trying to find these patients. So they advertise. So a subject will say, oh, I do have psoriasis, and that study sounds good. They don't know they just finished the same study at a different site 3 months ago, and now they're going to re-enroll because there's no tool that tells the site the subject has enrolled.
Right.
Now let's also add to this, because this is like a perfect storm, vaccines. I don't know if you read the Pfizer Lyme disease vaccine article, but Pfizer unfortunately had a horrible issue with not just duplicate subjects and not subjects just going back and forth trying to they did get into their trial multiple times, but they just did an article about site fraud and that sites were making up subjects. So there's just all of these different areas of research that we can help protect, and we can do a better job of an industry to help the sites better choose a better quality subject, run them through screening, and then track and protect those subjects all the way through the clinical trial. So why the sponsors across the board are not considering this good clinical practice? I mean, I'm a nurse practitioner. Why are they not? And the sites, they don't have the financial means. It's not their job. It's not their data. This should be something that the sites need to ask the sponsors, well, what are you doing about co-enrollment? Because if my subject then enrolls at another site down the street, what are you doing to protect this subject? Like, can the sites turn this around? Can the sites ask for help and ensure that the sponsors know what the message is? The message is they want help choosing the best quality subjects. Sites don't want to fail. Sites don't want to early terminate their subject because they got caught dual enrolling at their site. It makes us look bad. We have to report to the IRB. We have extra work. We don't want that. So why not use technology that's like a low-cost insurance policy to help the sites really screen the subject's eligibility early on and then track and protect the subject throughout?
Yeah, I mean, well, you touched on a lot of really important points there. I think if you've worked at a site, you definitely have felt like that PI stands for private investigator sometimes instead of, principal investigator. You're like, even under the best circumstances, patients tend to be really poor historians, even when they mean well and are fairly, educated. But yeah, I know, like you mentioned, we're sort of like asking them to learn and understand the rules to a game that they don't really understand, right? It's not really fair to do that. And there's no reason we shouldn't be able to get objective data rather than, but you're just going, okay, have you ever been in a trial before? No. Okay, great. Next question. Right. Boom. And oftentimes that's what happens.
Well, and the FDA is coming in and asking these questions. And if they don't have a system in place, they're getting a 483. The site does not choose the technology they use. They don't get to choose which IRT system. They don't get to choose which central laboratory. This really does have to come from the sponsor. And back to your point, the subject being a poor historian, the half-life of the drug is not even listed in the informed consent. So when a protocol asks for 5 half-lives, the subject looks at you like you're cross-eyed. Like, what are you talking about? What is a half-life? Then let's say you even get the name of the past research company. They may have closed. They probably have their documents in storage, and the coordinator is crazy busy. Like, coordinators don't have time to be looking at this information and passing it forward. So it's a very difficult situation. So to have a real-time answer by consenting the subject, having the subject run through verified clinical trials, and giving that coordinator a real-time answer right at the beginning of screening saves them time and monies in not even fully screening an ineligible subject. And if there's a washout period violation or a half-life violation, then we can give the coordinator the appropriate time frame where the subject is eligible. So we don't cause a protocol violation and we save everyone time and money. We don't want to lose that subject. Patients are like diamonds, right? Once you find one, they're really, really valuable. But you want to protect that subject and you want to prevent a protocol violation. So again, I think this comes down to the sponsors need to step up and they need to do a better job for their sites and for their patients. You know, at the end of the day, this data is going to the FDA. And if it's not the highest quality data, then what are we doing? Oh, that's where we have black box warnings because our research was not clean enough. And if you have fraudulent subjects, how do you know the data throughout is clean and correct? It's probably not. And then you have black box warnings because that's the real story once it's approved.
Ultimately, yeah, I mean, it's about doing good science, right? I mean, if you have all these other variables going on, then it's going to affect your data. It's bad for everybody. That's not just bad for your site or for your research participant, but it could be bad for everyone who takes that drug.
Millions.
Because the data wasn't, clean and accurate. So,
right.
No, I mean, it's much bigger implications.
Right. If you look at Vioxx, if you look at, Viagra, you look at some of the medications that the research did not tell the true story. And you wonder really, why is that? Were there bad players? And then the other thing that really frustrates me is when we speak to, because a lot of things frustrate me, obviously, but the thing that also frustrates me is that when we speak to sponsors or CROs, they're like, well, we don't pay our patients. Yeah, you do. Every study pays for time and travel, and those can add up. So subjects are getting free medication, free care, plus they're getting $100, $200, sometimes $500 for a few hours of their time. So if you're doing that in multiple places, you're making some money. You're paying your bills. Plus, you're also getting free care. So that's a win-win. So we have to look at the true story of what's happening in our industry and what's happening on the front lines. And I think sites are probably one of the biggest proponents of using technology, even though they have a lot of systems they log into now. And I know that it's only getting more complicated. But this actually saves time, saves money, and improves subject safety and data quality. So this little step, it takes 20 seconds to verify a subject, but the answer is so powerful and is so protective that, again, I'm amazed that every sponsor, even though we have over 1 million subjects in our database and we work with thousands of trials. We're in over 40 countries right now, active in 40 countries. Why isn't this just good clinical practice from the sponsor level down? And I feel like sites, like they should vet their sponsors and say, what are you doing to protect us?
Yeah, no, and honestly, when I think back, it's shockingly few studies that do institute some sort of check from the sponsor side like that. I'm seeing it a little bit more. I've seen it more with certain sponsors more than others, but overwhelmingly, most of them don't have any sort of objective way to check that. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And, I'd seen you guys for a while, and I was always like, who are these guys? Because honestly, and I've seen you more in studies over the last couple of years, I will say, but I mean, it seems like this would be more ubiquitous than it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, over the last few years, we have grown exponentially and, in the US have over 1 million subjects within our database, but that's not enough. And, we think of some of the sponsors that now work with us across their pipeline, they've seen the issue, they've gotten burned, they know this is real. But many sponsors are still like, we haven't seen that in our studies. And we're like, because you don't know what you don't know. And with all the privacy regulations that are now coming into place, we're no longer collecting initials. You're no longer collecting full dates of birth. So this is a perfect storm for the professional research subject. You've made it easier for these subjects to slip through the cracks. So even more reason to use verified clinical trials. So I think it's, again, it's a simple step that, I'm obviously very passionate about, but this comes down to the reason we ended up creating this was we had no way to protect our subjects, whether it be fraudulent, deceptive, or just they didn't know the rules of our industry, or as you said, they're not great historians. They don't know that this could harm them. Like if they get a drug, and we work with about 80% of the phase 1 units, so we track a drug through its lifespan. But if you have a drug that can only be taken to a certain extent or has a maximum tolerated dose, without technology and going across phases of research, you really are in a dangerous situation. And to my knowledge, there is no system like ours that protects at all the number of protocol violations we look at. So we don't only look at dual enrollment and dual screening, we look at re-enrollment, we make sure that rescreening after screen failure is approved, exclusionary compounds, exclusionary classes. So again, we do a lot of vaccine trials. If they've taken a flu vaccine a month ago, they don't want to go into an RSV or COVID vaccine or Lyme's disease vaccine in a month because of how long that drug is in their system. Right. Same thing we see with monoclonal antibodies, biologics, long half-lives can be very dangerous. So there's a lot of protections, and we are the only system with the intellectual property. So for a lot of reasons and the size of our database, we are the gold standard. I just wish that more sponsors would understand that this is their data and this is their responsibility.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. In some ways, I've never considered it in that regard. But I mean, because again, it's the site, you feel like everything is sort of just shoved on you as here you figure it out. And, it's not. It's not our data. That is a very good point. Do you feel this is something I find interesting too, as we are moving into a world of, decentralization? Something you point out that kind of resonates that I've seen is, especially in trials where, we haven't verified clinical trials, has not been in there. People goof up, and that's how you find out, like, oh, we're seeing you're in a headache trial down the street and you're in our headache trial. Something's not right here. But as we move into more decentralization, where maybe there's less interaction and there's less contact and there's less relationship built between maybe site staff and research participants, is this going to become, do you think, even more of a problem as maybe there's a certain level of, I wouldn't say anonymity, because, you can't really anonymously be in a clinical trial. But I do think if you have less opportunities to sort of catch on to what's going on, does that make it more attractive or easier for patients to sort of fall in the gaps?
Absolutely. I think decentralized trials, to me, are a little bit scary for our industry. And that is for that reason. I think we've lost a little bit of control. And I think there's a big focus on those. And when COVID hit, and how are we going to continue? And I think in certain situations, absolutely, like bringing this trial to the subject. But when you look at these big decentralized trials, that is, again, a perfect storm for the professional research subject. There is anonymity. And so if the subject wants to be fraudulent and use another person's ID, or use a tampered with ID, or use a fake ID, what can other systems do? You can't do anything. With verified clinical trials, we have biometric technology. And so we actually prevent against that fake ID usage by having a biometric reader.
Get a fingerprint?
It's a fingerprint scanner, right? And it's actually not the fingerprint, it's reproducible spots on the finger. But when you think about decentralized trial, how can you really do that? You can't be sending scanners out. So we actually are in the finalizing process of facial recognition for decentralized trials, because I do think they're at most risk because, again, using fake IDs, a tampered with ID or fraudulent ID is a really easy thing. I mean, if you have teenage sons, you know how easy it is to get a fake ID. So I think it's something that we've seen in industries. Actually, some of our phase 1 partners, they had situations where one subject screened and then the brother showed up with the other one's ID, and they didn't catch it until after he had already dosed and they were in multiple periods of dosing. But it's because he wouldn't, when they called his name, he really never reacted. And then they finally investigated and found out the subject they screened was not even the subject that they dosed. So having biometric readings is also a really good idea. But we've had people who've brought in fake IDs, their sister's ID, tampered with that ID. Again, without biometrics, these people can just be gaming the system. Decentralized trials adds a whole new complexity. I think in some ways the PI, they use some of these companies that do decentralized trial and they manage it all. I don't know the quality of the management that they are able to instill. And, I think there's a lot of amazing research sites across the world. And I think that bringing the patients to those sites is a better idea of how to conduct clinical research, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, and, truthfully, I do think it'll be a sort of hybrid future, and that's fine. Makes sense to me. But I mean, how much easier would it be to send anyone to a local lab that's not really under the PI's purview? Anyone can show up and show an ID or whatever the case may be. Not that this is rampant necessarily, but it just seems very ripe for that sort of thing. If patients wanted to or needed to do that, and you can end up in a real mess. Again, to your point, we're sort of giving up some control here, which I think opens the door for not just quality issues on the whole, but, people who want to be deceptive. I think it'll be a little bit easier for them to get away with.
Absolutely. And then you have to have cross coverage. You have to have, I think Verified is a unique company. It's not a CRO. It's not a sponsor. You got to go across. So we've done over 10,000 trials in the US alone. You got to have that coverage. You got to have your tentacles out. We're the only system that works with the NIH and works with NIDA. And then we have the phase 1 units. And then you have the sponsors with your phase 2 and 3. You've got to cross coverage. People don't stay in their own lane. As I mentioned earlier, they don't have just one comorbidity. So even if a sponsor is going into, let's say, a rare disease, and they're like, how much experience could Verified really have in rare disease? Maybe not that much, but you're going to protect yourself against yourself. So subjects with that rare disease who are desperate don't enroll in multiple sites. Plus also, they don't have one comorbidity. They might have a mental illness. They might have a skin disease. They might have GI issues. Well, I could, go on, and you don't know where else they're going. So, and especially like we do we do a lot of like the cannabis and the psychedelics, and you don't know where your subjects are going for other, whether it be social or comorbidities. So you really have to think about, again, how are you helping the site truly assess the subject's eligibility coming in? And then how are you tracking and protecting that subject throughout? So if a subject's enrolled in your trial, the PI has no idea what that subject does when he leaves his or her site. I don't know, my subject just went 2 towns away and is now trying to screen for another study. But with VCT, you do. You know that, and you can re-educate the subject or educate the subject of the rules of our industry, and you can really assess the trustworthiness of that subject. We have many subjects who will go from site to site to site. They know the study's using VCT. They've read the consent 5 times now in the same day. It is amazing the extent some of these patients will go to. But I do think there's not just that, as we said, deceptive population. There's other reasons, and there's other issues going on. And, we use technology.
I admittedly had not considered that a lot. Again, even before then, before really sort of starting my own site network, I hadn't really seen much of that, or at least hadn't caught it before. And then over the last couple of years to start to see some of these patients try to come in and screen and rescreen, and clearly are just answering any ad they can find, not knowing that they're all coming back to us, where I'm like, okay, this is like the 5th time you've tried to come screen for this trial. Yeah, to be able to see it more and more, and then to start to understand like the consequences of what that, can have down the road. And I'm all for controlling as many variables as we can. This is just another way to ensure that, again, we're doing good science, right?
Correct. So, yeah, and you obviously were very astute to know these people were coming back. We have subjects who show up 6 months later, 8 months later to the same site, and the site's like, oh my God, I totally forgot that was subject 021, and now we're at subject 145. We didn't even recognize him. I mean, again, there's only so much human ability, whether it be the subject or the site. And also, we've had sponsors say to us, well, we just won't use sites in Miami, or we just won't use sites in Texas or New York. These sites are great sites. They are good quality sites, and they can produce. You're not giving them the tool. Again, you want a subject who weighs, between 120 and 180. You don't give them a scale. Like this is not a guessing game. This is not asking the subject and believing everything they say. You have to use technology and use a tool, and it's there. Put it in your protocol. It's really not that hard.
It's funny, and I feel like that's a lot of the coordinator-patient relationship, participant relationship. A lot of the times is just trusting that they're telling you the right thing. Did you take your medication, or did you throw it down the drain? I don't know. We're taking your word for it. Obviously, there's PKs and things like that can answer those questions. But again, you're taking subjectivity out of it, right? And not just making it of like, well, let's hope we can trust this guy, that he's not down the street in the same study or in 3 other studies with these drugs all interacting with each other in ways that we don't even know what that could possibly mean for them.
Exactly. If you think about PK levels, right? A lot of sponsors have found out due to PK levels in the middle of the study that a subject who was assigned placebo is now showing drug in their system, which means they're enrolled in a site, another site, or 2 sites, but the subject is halfway through the trial at this point. You have wasted tens of thousands, if not, or $100,000s of dollars. Now you got to discontinue 2 subjects, maybe 3, maybe more, depending on how many times that subject enrolled in different sites, and you got to replace. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars wasted when you could have done it at screening and you could have stopped it from even happening. So PKs are great. They're amazing, right? But it's too late. It's too late in the scenario. And that's the problem also when like sponsors will say, oh, we have our own system. Okay, you really don't have your own system. Let me just tell you, you don't. And if you do, you're finding out only if a monitor recognizes initials and date of birth in the same region, but you're in your own silo. You're talking about only your study. So again, with the privacy and the security regulations, which are great, that are only increasing, it is not great for our detection of professional research subjects in the industry, detection of professional research subjects and dual enrollers. But with VCT, obviously, it's something that you can do early on and instantaneous.
Well, and anything that helps break down the silos that exist, because I think this is an industry that's so heavy with siloing. Again, like, I don't know what the guy down the street's doing. There are sites within the same networks who don't know what each other are doing.
Exactly.
I worked at a university where every department worked completely differently from each other. So, tracking down that even within the same building may be nearly impossible without something that lays across, the bigger picture of the ecosystem. So yeah, anything that helps standardize, I think is beautiful. And this is a really great example. And I know I have used it before. Another thing I will say is that it's really easy for sites, because frankly, that can be a make or break for site adoption, right? Like if it's a pain in the ass for a site to use, they're not going to want to do it. But your guys' solution is very easy and gives you feedback immediately. You're not sitting around waiting. Having used it before, I can say that it's pretty seamless and super insightful as well.
Thank you. I mean, again, I'm a past bidder coordinator. So creating something very simple and one step was our goal. Again, I say it to my partner who was my PI. I was like, I do everything. You sign, blah, blah, blah. And it was a joke of ours, but I think clinical research trials have only increased the demands on the coordinators. And there's so many systems. So when we were creating Verified, we really were very focused on, we have to make this a 20-second process. They have to get instant results, and then they're done. They're absolutely done. So how we track and protect the subjects is through a data transfer with the IRT system or EDC system. And we have APIs or SFTPs, and we get that information. So once a subject's verified, we begin our protections, but then we carry them on through last visit.
Yeah, no, and again, it's deceptively easy because I remember I got it and I was like, oh, okay, here's this finger scanner. This is going to be a whole to do. But then again, recognizing it's actually really easy. And, I think we did have a patient or two that we had seen that had been, I think they ended up being okay, but it did show that they had been in a trial or maybe screen failed for a trial in a different program, maybe.
Yeah, you definitely had some protocol violations that were detected and prevented, most importantly. And then again, it's sometimes the subject does not know the rules of our industry. And even though they read the consent, I mean, how much are they really reading it? Yeah. And it might say you can't be in another clinical trial, but they think, oh, well, that's just for my, I'm just getting Botox, for sweating, and that's a clinical trial, but that doesn't affect like my depression. And they don't really realize how much interaction or adverse events there could be, because this is why we're testing this. We don't know really. So to put 2 concomitant medications, investigational products in the subject's system has led to death, has led to AEs, SAEs, et cetera. So quite alarming, quite scary.
Well, and again, I'm not going to lie. The first times I had seen, VCT, I was like, well, I'm in Oklahoma City. There's really not that much research. Surely this isn't really like a problem, really, right? Like this can't be that big of a deal. I wouldn't say I was pleasantly surprised, but I was, surprised to see it catch people and then feel like, okay, well, that sort of validates the whole reason right there. Even if you catch one, I feel like it's probably worth it for,
right.
in terms of data cleanliness, protocol deviation, and patient safety, right? I mean,
absolutely. And when you look at the data, and now we have over a decade of data, subjects like, let's say CNS, which is a big sweet spot for us. Average travel distance is over 60 miles to game the system. Vaccine trials, over 150 miles to game the system. Cannabis trials, don't even get me started. It is, they won't just stay in their neighborhood. And sometimes when you're in a Southern Florida or Southern California, New York, some parts of Texas, there are hundreds of research sites within a 20-mile radius. So very easy to get around and to game the system. But subjects aren't stopping. Like Midwest, we have huge metrics from the Midwest. And you think like, what? Like, how do they get into these sites? Well, they're driving or they're taking a bus. And for different conditions, there are obviously higher incidence. When we deal with pain studies, drug studies, there's a higher incidence, vaccine trials, CNS. And then we do have some that are slightly smaller. But as you said, you stop 1 or 2 subjects from either having an SAE and being hospitalized or affecting your data quality, you can ruin a trial with a very small number of subjects who are fraudulent and are ruining your data.
Yeah, no, again, I couldn't agree more. And again, took a little bit to convert me on the importance. So I do hope we see that be adopted more. And I mean, it is when you think about, when you do stand back and think about just how little we do in terms of verifying that stuff, it is kind of scary,
It's horrific. We're just not doing a good enough job. And the industry in general, I think, moves really slow. And sometimes, okay, but when you have technology that can help the process be better, then why aren't you utilizing it? And if you see that we have all of this metrics of 10,000 trials and over 1 million subjects, the data speaks for itself. I think sponsors need to really take responsibility and step up. And I think sites have a big voice right now. They're very powerful. And sponsors listen to sites. So I think sites want to say to the sponsors, like, you got to give us technology to help us really assess the subject eligibility, or your data may be affected. Your data may be ruined. We can't do this alone.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, there's also always a soft spot in solutions that were created at the site level. I love that too. Like, I think that's where there's still like a ton of innovation to be had, is by people at the sites realizing like, hey, this is a huge problem.
Right.
Let's do something about it. Right.
100%. I say it to my staff all the time. In my current VCT staff, I'm like, keep looking. This is just one thing. This is one thing that we just got so frustrated with that it was really a tipping point for us as a research site that we were like, wait a minute, why can't we? We added a new process into research. We added a new step. But there are many steps, and you just need to find where that gap is. And research site staff are the best ones. They are on the front lines. They know what is happening. So if you are able to find that gap and fill it, you're improving the whole research industry. It's not about yourself. It's about, are we making this process safer, and are we making this process better?
Yeah. And I talk to sites every week. I find that a lot of our experiences are super universal, right? We're all going through a lot of the same pain points, dealing with the same problems. So again, solving a problem for your site could potentially solve a problem for hundreds or thousands of sites. I love seeing solutions that are sort of bottom up versus top down. I think they tend to be the most practical, generally the most well adopted, because they're coming from the people who are down there in the trenches, so to speak, So I have a lot of respect for that. I always love hearing those stories.
Thank you. It's funny when I speak to some sites, they're like, you created this? Like, you did? I'm like, with a lot of help. Yes,
Right.
a lot of help. It took about 2 years to build the database because we knew how much it had to do and how many protocol violations it had to prevent. And we also knew that this had to be super quick and super efficient, or else, we wanted to stay on the good side of the sites because that is, and who does all of the data. And so we knew how many systems were coming their way. And you could see it. And, this was back in 2009, and we were already starting to get inundated with, you're going to use this system, you're going to use this system, you're going to use this system. So a lot of times we'll work with either the eSource or the IRT to do a one sign-on, like a single sign-on process, so that it's streamlined for the coordinators. I'm a huge coordinator protector.
I mean, that's awesome. I think obviously we're at, and maybe the bubble's starting to burst a little bit right now, but, so many solutions. The problem is that I think a lot of them don't have that advantage of having been at a site and knowing what processes actually, like, where it fits, right? Because having a solution is great, but if you don't have a process around it or doesn't fit into what's happening, it's almost useless. Or if you're forced to use it, it's more of a pain in the ass than it's worth, and no one wants to use it anymore. Maybe the best solution in the world, but it just doesn't fit. They don't have that context to make it work correctly. So again, that's why I think, the bottom up solutions make the most sense. And you're like, oh, well, yeah, of course. They know, they've had to deal with it. And being the ones who came up with it, they had to do it. So they're going to make it as easy on themselves as possible, not just for some buyer out there to look flashy, right? So again, hats off to you guys, because I love that. I didn't realize that, you guys came from, like, it started at the site level. So again, very cool.
Yeah, exactly. I like when you say bottom up, I think bottoms up. Like,
well, that's you.
It's only 11:49, but that's what I thought of.
Hey, that's okay. That's okay. Anything else before we sort of wrap up here? This has been really enlightening, and I think I learned a lot more than I expected to. So,
I'm glad. I mean, I just thank you for the opportunity. I love your podcast. I think you have a big voice for the sites, and I think that's important. I hope you continue to do what you're doing. It's innovative, and it's not done enough, I believe.
Well, I'll keep going, for better or worse. So we'll see.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Kerri, where can people find you online and learn more about verified clinical trials?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Kerri Weingard, and also can always email info@Verified Clinical Trials, or me directly, KWEINGARD @verifiedclinicaltrials.com. Love to hear any feedback, input, inquiries. I love actually speaking to the site staff, and presenting at investigators meetings or site initiation visits is always great, because you really do get the frontline stories, and I wish there were more sponsors listening to some of those. So thank you, Brad. Thank you.
Absolutely. We'll put your info in the show notes. And once again, Kerri, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.